What if I told you that the greatest minds in human history achieved their brilliance not through books or lectures, but through something so simple we've forgotten it exists? Tonight, I want to reveal why Socrates never owned a single scroll, why Aristotle's most important lessons happened while walking, and why the secret to Greek genius had nothing to do with being naturally smart. This is the story of how ordinary people became extraordinary thinkers using methods that would seem completely backwards today. Welcome, I'm the historian. I have walked through the dust of ages, and today, I will tell you what I saw when the Mediterranean sun cast long shadows through the marble columns of the Stoa, when philosophers gathered not in lecture halls but in the very heart of the bustling agora, breathing the same air as merchants hawking figs and fishermen arguing over prices. Before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy stories that reveal the hidden connections between ancient wisdom and modern life. And let us know where you are watching from. What time is it for you right now? Sometimes the most profound truths are found in the most unexpected places. Now dim the lights. Perhaps turn on a fan for some gentle background noise, and let me show you why Greek philosophers weren't just smart. They were operating their minds in ways we've almost completely forgotten. I remember the first time I saw Aristotle teach. It wasn't in some grand amphitheater or marble-columned hall. No, he was walking, always walking. His students, they called them the peripatetics, the walkabouts, followed behind him like a parade of eager ducklings, stumbling occasionally over the uneven stones of Athens as their master's mind wandered through problems that wouldn't be solved for another 2,000 years. You have to understand, this wasn't just a casual stroll. This was deliberate. Aristotle believed, knew, really, that the mind thought differently when the body moved. While he walked, his hands would gesture, sketching invisible diagrams in the air, his voice carrying across the olive groves as he untangled questions about the nature of being itself. I watched him once spend an entire afternoon walking circles around a single olive tree, his students trailing behind, as he worked through what would later become the foundation of logic. Step by step, literally, he built the framework for how humans reason. Left foot, premise 1. Right foot, premise 2. Another step, conclusion. The rhythm of walking became the rhythm of thought itself. But Aristotle wasn't unique in this. I had seen it before and would see it again. Across the ancient world, the greatest minds understood something we've forgotten in our age of desk chairs and fluorescent lights. Thinking and moving were never meant to be separated. The Greeks had a word for this: kinetic contemplation, though they rarely needed to name it because it was simply how thinking was done. You didn't sit still to solve problems. You walked them out, quite literally. The body wasn't a vehicle carrying the brain around. It was part of the thinking process itself. I remember mornings in the Lyceum when Aristotle would assign his students specific walking patterns for different types of problems. Straight lines for logical progression, circles for examining an issue from all angles, figure eights for comparing and contrasting ideas. They looked like dancers, these philosophers, moving through space as their minds moved through concepts. The results were extraordinary. Students who had seemed average while sitting still would suddenly grasp complex ideas while walking. Problems that had stumped them for weeks would unravel during a casual stroll. It wasn't magic, it was biology. Something about the rhythmic movement, the gentle increase in heart rate, the way the landscape shifted past their eyes, unlocked parts of their minds that remained stubbornly closed in stillness. Modern science would eventually catch up to what Aristotle knew instinctively. Walking increases blood flow to the brain. It stimulates the release of chemicals that improve memory and focus. The bilateral movement activates both hemispheres of the brain simultaneously. But Aristotle didn't need studies or statistics. He simply observed. His students thought better while walking, so walking became philosophy. I watched this principle spread beyond just formal education. In the agora, the great marketplace of Athens, philosophers would take their debates on walking tours through the city. Socrates was famous for this. He'd corner some poor, unsuspecting citizen, a merchant, a politician, a young man convinced of his own wisdom, and begin one of his infamous questioning sessions while walking the length of the market and back. The walking wasn't incidental to these conversations. It was essential. Something about moving together, falling into the same rhythm, breathing the same air, made people more open to having their assumptions challenged. The physical act of walking side by side created a mental state of companionship, even when Socrates was systematically dismantling everything they thought they knew. I remember one particular afternoon when Socrates encountered a young soldier, fresh from victory in some minor skirmish, absolutely convinced that courage was simply the absence of fear. They began talking near the pottery stalls, and by the time they had walked to the temple steps and back, perhaps a journey of 30 minutes, the young man had discovered that courage was far more complex than he'd ever imagined. The walking had given his mind space to explore, to doubt, to discover. This wasn't just a philosophical method, it was cognitive enhancement. The Greeks had stumbled onto something profound. The human brain evolved to think while moving. For millions of years, our ancestors solved problems while walking, tracking prey, finding water, navigating terrain. The sedentary life of modern civilization goes against our deepest neurological programming. But the walking was just the beginning. What made it truly powerful was where they walked. The philosophers of Athens didn't confine themselves to academic spaces. They walked through the real world, past the blacksmith's forges, through the fish market, along the roads where farmers brought their goods to sell. Their thinking was constantly cross-pollinated by the sights, sounds, and smells of actual life. I watched Plato develop his theory of forms partly by observing the relationship between a master craftsman and his apprentice in a pottery workshop. The perfect circle existed in the potter's mind, but every physical circle was merely an approximation. This wasn't abstract philosophizing. It was thinking grounded in the texture of real experience. The walking philosophers understood that. Isolation bred stale thinking. By moving through the world, engaging with merchants and artisans, soldiers and slaves, they kept their ideas connected to human reality. Their philosophy wasn't theoretical. It was practical, tested against the complexity of actual life, and the walking never stopped. Even in old age, even when their joints ached and their breath came shorter, they kept walking, because they knew that to stop moving was to stop thinking in the deepest sense. The rhythm of their feet had become the rhythm of their minds, and they couldn't separate the two without losing something essential. I've seen this principle play out across cultures and centuries. The Islamic scholars of medieval Baghdad walked as they debated. The Buddhist monks of ancient India developed walking meditation. Even in the modern world, the greatest thinkers often do their best work while moving. Darwin had his thinking path at his estate. Einstein was famous for his long walks through Princeton. Steve Jobs conducted many of his most important meetings while walking, but somehow, we've lost this wisdom. We've convinced ourselves that serious thinking requires sitting still, preferably hunched over a desk, staring at screens. We've created a world of sedentary contemplation, and then we wonder why our thinking feels stuck, why innovation comes so slowly, why students struggle to grasp complex ideas. The Greeks knew better. They understood that the body and mind weren't separate entities, but parts of a single system. To optimize one, you had to engage the other. Walking wasn't just exercise, it was thinking made physical, philosophy in motion. As I watched Aristotle age, I noticed he never really retired. Even when his body began to fail, even when walking became difficult, he continued to think in movement. He would rock gently in his chair, tap his fingers in complex patterns, keep some part of his body moving as his mind worked through problems. The motion had become so fundamental to his thinking process that complete stillness felt like a kind of death, and perhaps it was. When the great philosophers finally stopped moving, their thinking often stopped too. Not because age had dimmed their intelligence, but because they had severed the connection between body and mind that had made their insights possible in the first place. The walking philosophers of ancient Greece had discovered something we're only now beginning to understand. Intelligence isn't just what happens in your head. It's what happens when your whole body participates in the process of thinking. They were intelligent not despite their movement, but because of it. But there was something else, something even more fundamental than their walking. I discovered it by accident, really, during one of those perfect Athens evenings when the air held the scent of jasmine and the distant sound of lyres. I was following Socrates, as one does when trying to understand the nature of wisdom, when he stopped mid-conversation with a young student. Just stopped. Completely. His famous rapid-fire questions ceased. His gestures still. And he listened, not to the student who had been prattling on about justice, but to something else entirely. A bird was singing in a nearby olive tree. Nothing spectacular, just a common blackbird. But Socrates tilted his head, his entire being focused on that simple sound. The student, confused, fell silent. And in that silence, something shifted. "Did you hear that?" Socrates asked finally. The student nodded impatiently. Of course he had heard it. It was just a bird. "No," Socrates said gently. "Did you really hear it?" The pause between the third and fourth note. The way it echoed off the temple wall. The fact that it stopped when the cart passed, then resumed with a slightly different rhythm. The young man's face changed. He had heard a bird. Socrates had heard a conversation between sound and space, a dialogue between creature and environment, a small piece of the vast symphony that played continuously around them, but which most people never truly noticed. This was the Greek second secret. They had elevated listening to an art form, a spiritual practice, a path to knowledge that we've almost entirely forgotten. You see, we think of the ancient philosophers as great talkers, and they were. But before they talked, they listened, really listened, with an intensity and focus that modern people rarely experience. I watched this play out again and again. Before Plato would begin teaching, he would sit in complete silence, his attention spread wide, taking in not just the obvious sounds, voices, footsteps, market noise, but the subtle ones. The way sound reflected off different surfaces, the quality of silence between words, the emotional undertones in a speaker's voice that revealed more than their actual statements. This wasn't passive hearing. This was active, engaged, almost aggressive listening. They listened to the way a hunter tracks prey, the way a musician follows a complex melody, the way a lover attends to their beloved's breathing and sleep. The Greeks understood that most. Human knowledge comes through the ears, not the eyes, despite what our visual culture might suggest. They knew that listening shaped thinking in ways that reading never could. When you hear an idea spoken aloud, you encounter not just its content, but its rhythm, its emotional coloring, its relationship to silence and breath. I remember sitting in on discussions at the academy where students would spend hours analyzing not just what their teacher had said, but how he had said it. The pace of his speech, the places where he paused, the way his voice changed when he was uncertain versus when he was building to an important point. They understood that meaning lived as much in these subtleties as in the actual words. A pause could indicate doubt, confusion, or the approach of a profound insight. A change in vocal rhythm might signal a shift from established knowledge to original thinking. They listened for these markers the way sailors read wind patterns. But this deep listening extended far beyond human conversation. The Greeks lived in a world where the boundary between natural and supernatural, between ordinary and sacred, was fluid and permeable. They listened to everything as if it might contain wisdom. I watched Pythagoras spend entire afternoons listening to the sounds of his blacksmith's hammer, discovering in its rhythmic striking the mathematical relationships that would become the foundation of musical harmony. He heard ratios in that everyday sound, proportions that connected metalwork to starlight, human craft to cosmic order. Heraclitus would sit beside rivers for hours, not just watching but listening to the water as it moved over stones, around obstacles, through narrow passages. He heard in that flowing sound the principle that would define his philosophy, that everything changes, that the same river is never the same river twice, that reality itself is a process rather than a thing. This wasn't metaphorical listening. It was literal, physical, intense. They trained their ears the way athletes train their muscles, developing sensitivity to subtleties that most people never notice. The training was systematic. Young philosophy students would begin with exercises in silence, not meditation as we might understand it, but active silence, learning to distinguish between different qualities of quiet. The silence of dawn was different from the silence of dusk. The silence of worry was different from the silence of peace. They learned to read silence like a text. From silence, they moved to single sounds. A student might spend weeks learning to truly hear a single note played on a lyre, attending to its attack, its decay, its harmonics, the way it interacted with the acoustics of different spaces. They would discover that what seemed like a simple sound was actually a complex event, layered with information about the instrument, the player, the room, even the emotional state of the listener. Only after mastering simple sounds would they progress to complex acoustic environments. They would sit in the agora during busy market hours, learning to follow individual conversations through the chaos of competing voices. They would walk through residential neighborhoods in the evening, identifying the emotional tones of domestic discussions echoing from different houses. This training transformed how they thought. Students who learned to listen with this intensity found that their minds became more subtle, more nuanced, better able to distinguish between similar ideas, more sensitive to the logical and emotional relationships between concepts. I noticed that the great philosophers almost never interrupted each other, even during heated debates. They had learned that premature response kills understanding. They would let their opponent's argument complete itself fully before responding, attending not just to the logic, but to the passion, the uncertainty, the hidden assumptions that shaped the speaker's position. This created a different quality of dialogue entirely. Instead of the competitive back and forth we often see in modern debates, where each participant is simply waiting for their turn to speak, the Greeks engaged in something more like collaborative exploration. They listened so carefully to each other that they could respond to arguments that hadn't quite been made yet, ideas that were still forming in the speaker's mind. Socrates was the master of this. His famous questions weren't just logical probes. They were responses to things he had heard beneath the surface of what people said. When someone claimed to understand justice, Socrates would hear the uncertainty in their voice and craft questions that brought that uncertainty into the open. When someone spoke with false confidence, he would detect the hollowness and gently expose it. But perhaps most importantly, they listened to their own thinking. This was the most sophisticated skill of all, the ability to hear the quality of your own internal dialogue, to distinguish between thoughts that arose from genuine insight and thoughts that were merely habitual patterns. I watched Aristotle teach students to listen to the difference between ideas that came from careful observation and ideas that came from wishful thinking. He would have them notice the different felt sense of these mental states, how certain knowledge had a different internal sound than speculation, how genuine curiosity felt different than intellectual showing off. This internal listening became a form of quality control for their thinking. They could hear when they were reasoning clearly and when they were getting lost in abstraction. They could detect when their emotions were distorting their logic and when their logic was ignoring important emotional truths. The results were remarkable. Students trained in this kind of listening developed an almost supernatural ability to understand complex ideas quickly, to see connections that others missed, to ask questions that cut straight to the heart of problems. But perhaps most importantly, they developed what we might call intellectual humility. When you truly listen to others, to the world, to your own thinking, you become aware of how much you don't know, how much complexity lies hidden beneath the surface of seemingly simple things. This humility wasn't weakness, it was the foundation of their strength. Because they knew how much they didn't know, they remained curious. Because they heard the complexity in everything, they avoided simplistic answers. Because they listened so carefully to others, they could build on each other's insights in ways that multiplied their individual intelligence. The sacred art of listening had transformed not just how they learned, but how they lived. They inhabited a world that was alive with meaning, where every sound carried potential wisdom, where the quality of attention determined the quality of experience. Modern life has largely destroyed this capacity. We live surrounded by noise that we tune out, rather than tune into. We've confused information with understanding, data with wisdom. We listen to respond rather than to comprehend. But the Greeks showed us another way. They proved that listening, done with sufficient intensity and skill, could be a path to knowledge as powerful as any other. They heard their way to insights that still shape how we think about reality, consciousness, beauty, and truth. There was something else about the way they learned, something that would seem almost alien to our modern educational methods. I discovered it during a gathering at Plato's Academy, when I witnessed what could only be called intellectual warfare, but warfare of the gentlest, most loving kind imaginable. Picture this: a circle of young men, some bearded philosophers, others barely past adolescence, sitting in the shade of an ancient plane tree. No books, no scrolls, no lecture notes. Just voices and minds engaged in what they called dialectic, the art of thinking together through disagreement. But this wasn't a debate as we know it today. Modern debate is about winning, about crushing your opponent's arguments, about proving yourself right. The Greeks had invented something far more sophisticated. They had learned how to use disagreement as a tool for discovering truth. I watched Socrates work his magic that day. A young man, confident in his understanding of courage, had just finished explaining how courage was simply fearlessness in battle. The other students nodded appreciatively. It seemed like a solid, straightforward definition. Socrates smiled. That gentle, dangerous smile that meant someone's certainty was about to be lovingly dismantled. "Ah," he said, "so courage is fearlessness. And fearlessness means feeling no fear." "Exactly," the young man replied, pleased that his teacher seemed to agree. "I see. So the man who feels no fear when facing a lion is courageous." "Of course, and the man who feels no fear when facing a mouse." The young man hesitated. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't quite identify what. "Well, yes. So the person who suffers from a disease that prevents them from feeling fear at all, they would be the most courageous person alive." Now the young man was trapped. If courage was simply fearlessness, then yes, someone incapable of fear would be maximally courageous. But everyone could sense this was absurd. "But wait," another student interjected, "wouldn't someone who feels fear but acts anyway be more courageous than someone who feels no fear at all?" And now they were off. The entire group engaged in collaborative thinking. Each question revealed new complexities, new paradoxes, new depths to what had seemed like a simple concept. By the end of the discussion, no one could claim to fully understand courage, but everyone understood it more deeply than when they started. This was the Greeks' third secret. They had figured out how to make ignorance productive. In our modern educational system, ignorance is shameful. Students hide what they don't know, pretend to understand when they're confused, and avoid asking questions that might reveal their gaps in knowledge. We treat learning as if it were about accumulating correct answers rather than developing better questions. The Greeks understood that this approach kills genuine understanding. They had discovered that the admission of ignorance wasn't the end of learning. It was the beginning. Socrates famously claimed to know only one thing, that he knew nothing. But this wasn't false modesty. It was a sophisticated epistemological stance, a recognition that genuine knowledge is always provisional, always open to revision, always deepened by the discovery of new complexities. I watched him teach students to become comfortable with confusion, to see bewilderment not as a sign of failure, but as evidence that their minds were engaging with something genuinely challenging. He would deliberately lead discussions to points where everyone felt lost, where every assumption had been questioned, where the familiar territory of easy answers gave way to the unmarked wilderness of genuine inquiry. "Wonderful," he would exclaim when a student admitted complete confusion about something they had thought they understood. "Now we can begin to think." This created a culture where intellectual humility was valued more highly than intellectual confidence. Students competed not to have the best answers, but to ask the most penetrating questions. They sought out areas of ignorance the way gold miners seek out promising veins. The result was a kind of collaborative intelligence that was greater than the sum of its parts. When a group of people commit to exploring their ignorance together, when they use their differences of opinion as tools for deeper investigation rather than weapons for intellectual combat, something remarkable happens. Ideas emerge that none of them could have developed alone. I remember one discussion about the nature of justice that lasted for weeks, moving from the academy to private homes to walks in the countryside. Each participant brought different experiences, different perspectives, different kinds of confusion to the conversation. A young aristocrat understood justice differently than a former soldier, who understood it differently than a merchant's son. Instead of seeing these differences as obstacles to overcome, they treated them as resources to exploit. The aristocrat's assumptions about natural hierarchy would be gently challenged by the merchant's experience of negotiated fairness. The soldier's understanding of justice as victory would be complicated by the philosopher's questions about whether might makes right. Through weeks of patient exploration, they developed an understanding of justice that was more nuanced, more complete, more practically useful than any of them could have achieved alone. They had learned to think with multiple minds, to see problems from angles none of them possessed individually. But this process required remarkable emotional discipline. It's natural to defend your ideas, to feel attacked when someone questions your beliefs, to become angry when forced to confront the limitations of your understanding. The Greeks had to learn to separate their egos from their ideas, to welcome challenges as gifts rather than threats. This wasn't easy. I watched many students struggle with the emotional demands of genuine dialectic. Some would become defensive, turning collaborative inquiry back into competitive debate. Others would become paralyzed by doubt, unable to commit to any position, once they realized how complex everything was. But those who mastered the emotional art of productive disagreement developed intellectual capabilities that seemed almost supernatural. They could hold multiple contradictory ideas simultaneously. Without anxiety, they could change their minds without losing face. They could disagree passionately with someone while remaining genuinely curious about their perspective. Aristotle codified many of these practices, creating systematic methods for thinking through disagreement. He taught students to always present their opponent's arguments in their strongest form before attempting to refute them. He insisted that genuine refutation required understanding, that you couldn't properly disagree with a position you couldn't accurately represent. But beyond formal logical techniques, the Greeks had developed what we might call the ethics of intellectual engagement. They had rules, mostly unspoken but universally understood, about how to disagree productively. Never attack the person, only their ideas. Always assume your opponent is intelligent and well-intentioned until proven otherwise. Look for the grain of truth in every position, no matter how wrong it seems overall. Be willing to abandon your own position if the evidence warrants it. Treat every conversation as an opportunity to learn something, even when teaching. These weren't just philosophical principles. They were practical skills that made their discussions more productive, their learning more efficient, their intellectual community more creative and supportive. I noticed that students trained in this kind of dialectical thinking developed a particular kind of mental agility. They could see problems from multiple angles simultaneously. They were comfortable with uncertainty and complexity. They had learned to use disagreement as a tool for discovery rather than a weapon for domination. Most importantly, they had learned to enjoy being wrong, not because wrongness was good in itself, but because discovering you were wrong meant you were about to learn something new. Being corrected wasn't humiliation. It was liberation from error, an opportunity to upgrade your understanding. This created a feedback loop that accelerated their intellectual development. Because they weren't defensive about their mistakes, they could learn from them quickly. Because they sought out people who disagreed with them, they were constantly exposed to new ideas and perspectives. Because they treated every conversation as a collaborative investigation, they could build on each other's insights in ways that multiplied their individual capabilities. The Brotherhood of Questions had created a culture of learning that was both rigorous and joyful, both challenging and supportive. They had figured out how to make intellectual growth a social activity, and how to use the natural diversity of human perspectives as an engine for deeper understanding. But perhaps most remarkably, they had learned to see ignorance not as a problem to be eliminated, but as a resource to be cultivated. The more they learned, the more they became aware of what they didn't know. The deeper their understanding became, the more complex and interesting their questions became. This wasn't the paradox of learning, it was the point of learning. They had discovered that genuine knowledge isn't a collection of correct answers, but an ever-deepening capacity for better questions. And questions, they knew, were best developed not in isolation, but in the company of other curious minds, other devoted seekers, other members of the eternal brotherhood of wonder. But there was one more secret, perhaps the most important of all. I glimpsed it during the Olympic Games, watching young men prepare their bodies for competition with an intensity and systematic approach that bordered on the obsessive. Hours of daily training, carefully planned diets, coaching and technique so precise it would make modern sports science jealous. Then I realized the Greeks applied this same systematic intensity to training their minds. We think of the ancient philosophers as naturally gifted thinkers who somehow emerged fully formed, like Athena from Zeus's head. But the truth was far more mundane and far more inspiring. They had developed systematic methods for intellectual training, exercises for the mind that were every bit as rigorous and methodical as their physical training regimens. I watched Plato's students engage in what could only be called mental calisthenics. Every morning, before the main lessons began, they would spend an hour in pure logical exercises, not learning philosophy, but strengthening the mental muscles that made philosophical thinking possible. One exercise I remember particularly well. Students would be given a simple statement: all swans are white, and required to generate as many counterarguments as possible, not because they disagreed with the statement, but to develop their capacity for seeing alternatives, for questioning assumptions, for thinking flexibly about any given proposition. Another exercise involved taking a complex philosophical argument and restating it in progressively simpler language until even a child could understand it, then building back up to technical precision. This wasn't just translation. It was training in the fundamental skill of understanding ideas so thoroughly that you could reshape them without losing their essential meaning. They practiced analogical thinking like musicians practice scales. Students would be given two seemingly unrelated concepts, say, justice and health, and required to explore every possible connection between them. How is a just society like a healthy body? How do laws function like medicine? What would corruption look like if it were a disease? These weren't idle games. They were developing the mental flexibility that allowed them to see patterns across different domains of knowledge, to transfer insights from one field to another, to think creatively about complex problems by finding unexpected connections. I watched them train their memories not just to store information, but to organize it in ways that enhanced understanding. They would memorize not just the content of important arguments, but their logical structure, so they could apply the same patterns of reasoning to new problems. They memorized examples and counterexamples, analogies and distinctions, building up vast internal libraries of thinking tools. But perhaps most importantly, they trained their attention itself. Modern people severely underestimate how difficult it is to think clearly for extended periods. Our minds wander, we get distracted, we lose the thread of complex arguments. We mistake familiar thoughts for new insights. The Greeks understood that sustained thinking was a skill that required training. They practiced holding complex ideas in mind for longer and longer periods. They developed exercises for detecting when their attention had wandered and techniques for bringing it back to the task at hand. I remember one exercise where students would attempt to follow a single line of reasoning for an entire hour without allowing their minds to drift to other topics. Most couldn't manage it for 5 minutes when they started, but with practice, they could maintain focused attention on complex problems for periods that would seem impossible to most modern people. They also trained what we might call intellectual patience, the ability to sit with difficult problems without rushing to premature solutions. In a culture that valued quick wit and clever responses, this was countercultural training. They learned to endure the discomfort of not knowing, to resist the temptation of easy answers, to keep working on problems even when progress seemed impossible. Aristotle systematized much of this training, creating curricula that built intellectual capacity progressively. Students began with simple exercises in categorization, learning to distinguish between different kinds of things, different levels of abstraction, different types of relationships between ideas. From there, they moved to exercises in definition, learning to state precisely what they meant by key terms, to recognize when definitions were too broad or too narrow, to understand how different definitions led to different conclusions about the same phenomena. Only after mastering these foundational skills would they attempt the more advanced work of constructing and evaluating complex arguments. By this point, their minds had been trained to handle complexity with precision, to follow intricate logical chains without getting lost, to see both the forest and the trees of sophisticated reasoning. But this training wasn't just about logic. They also developed their emotional and imaginative capabilities as tools for better thinking. They practiced empathy as a way of understanding different perspectives. They cultivated what they called noble emotions, feelings like wonder, gratitude, and reverence, that they believed enhanced rather than clouded their judgment. They trained their imaginations to be both vivid and disciplined. They could visualize complex scenarios in detail, but also control and modify those visualizations to explore different possibilities. They used storytelling and metaphor not as decoration, but as thinking tools, ways of exploring ideas that couldn't be captured in purely abstract terms. I noticed that students who underwent this kind of systematic training developed thinking capabilities that seemed almost magical to outside observers. They could understand complex ideas with remarkable speed, see connections that others missed, generate creative solutions to difficult problems, maintain focus and clarity even when discussing the most abstract topics. But there was nothing magical about it. Like Olympic athletes, they had simply trained more systematically and intensively than others. They had taken the natural human capacity for thought and refined it through deliberate practice until it became something extraordinary. Perhaps most importantly, They had learned to enjoy the process of mental training itself. Just as athletes can find joy in the burn of muscle fatigue, these philosophical athletes found satisfaction in the stretch of intellectual challenge. They sought out difficult problems not because they enjoyed being confused, but because they enjoyed the process of working through confusion to clarity. This created a positive feedback loop that accelerated their development. Because they enjoyed mental challenges, they sought out more difficult problems. Because they practiced regularly, they got better at handling complexity. Because they got better at thinking, they could tackle even more challenging questions. They had discovered that intelligence wasn't fixed, it was trainable. The capacity for sophisticated thought could be developed through systematic practice, just like any other human capability. They treated their minds like athletes treat their bodies, with respect, discipline, and systematic attention to improvement. But unlike physical training, which has obvious limits, mental training seems to have no ceiling. The better they got at thinking, the more interesting problems they could explore. The more they understood, the more they realized there was to understand. The deeper their questions became, the more profound their investigations could be. They had created a culture of intellectual athletics, where the highest achievement wasn't winning arguments, but developing the capacity for ever more sophisticated thinking. They competed not to defeat each other, but to push each other toward greater intellectual capabilities, and the results spoke for themselves. In a relatively small city over the span of just a few generations, they laid the foundations for logic, ethics, politics, aesthetics, psychology, biology, physics, and mathematics. They created ways of thinking about reality that are still productive 2.5 millennia later. This wasn't because they were naturally more intelligent than other people. It was because they had figured out how to train intelligence itself, how to develop thinking as a skill rather than just rely on it as a talent. They had created the gymnasium of the mind, and like all good athletes, they had trained there every single day. The walking philosophers of ancient Athens had discovered something we've almost entirely forgotten: that intelligence isn't just what happens inside your skull. It's what happens when your whole being participates in the act of thinking. They walked their way to wisdom, listened their way to understanding, questioned their way to truth, and trained their minds like Olympic athletes. They proved that genius isn't born. It's built step by step, question by question, day by day. In our age of screens and chairs, of quick answers and shorter attention spans, their methods seem almost impossibly demanding. But their results speak for themselves. In a single city, over just a few generations, they created ways of thinking about reality that we still use today. Perhaps it's time we remembered their secrets. Perhaps it's time we started walking again. I'm the historian. I have seen much, and I will see more. Perhaps, one day, I shall tell you again. The mind, like the body, grows stronger only when we dare to exercise it fully, not just with information, but with movement, attention, wonder, and the courage to remain forever curious about the magnificent complexity of being human.